Okay, good evening, everybody. My name is Doug Smith. I'm the chairman of the 375th Steering Committee, and I want to welcome you to another one of the Jim Garman lecture series. I hope some of you have been at the other ones. You'll know how great they are, and you'll know why he has to do two of these, because they're so popular. I have to say that I sat in on the first third of this last week, and it's really interesting, but I had to go somewhere else. So today's Jim's going to talk about Glen Farms with Portsmouth, the Vanderbilts, and all those folks. Very, very interesting stuff. I have to mention, though, Jim has been a stalwart on this 375th anniversary celebration that we've had going on all year. I hope you guys have had a chance to come to some of the events and things that have been going on around town. It's been kind of an interesting year for all of us, particularly busy one for this guy, though, because he's given at least one lecture every month from January to where we are now. And he's got a couple more to go, so we can't quite let him off the hook yet. And just join me in welcoming Jim Garman, our town historian. Jim?
All right, the gentleman farms, and what is a gentleman's farm? A gentleman's farm, in a lot of cases, were farms that were built out here in Portsmouth, put together, particularly in the period of 1880, 1910 or so, by people who had summered in Newport and then decided they wanted to get out into the country. And in most cases, what they did was to build farms that raised horses, sheep, dogs, a lot of other animals for show. And the farms continued over the course of the year, but the owners generally were here only for 6 to 8 weeks, usually in the summertime. And so we're going to deal a lot with these people. I think one of the things about this, and I did write a book about the gentleman's farm, which I have up here. When I sit at my desk in my office at my house, I look straight ahead and I see Oakland Farm, and I look to the left and I see Sandy Point, and I look to the right and I see Glen Farm. So I'm kind of surrounded by this. This whole thing got started, as far as these farms are concerned, with me when I was on one of the original members of the Glen Manor House Committee, Glen Manor House Authority, it's called now. But we were a committee of people in the Historical Society who, in 1978, I think it was, somewhere around there, where we were asked by the school department, the town had just purchased the building and the school, Elmhurst School, which is what they really wanted. They needed a school. And so they turned to some members of the Historical Society and said, what are we going to do with this building? And so under the leadership of Dick Cosimini and Barbara Kearney, we put this thing together, and obviously, as most of us know, I think it's a booming success and a big moneymaker for the town right now as a wedding palace and a function place. I served on that committee for about 28 years, and over time I would sit there and sort of say, wonder what it was like to live in this place, and now you'll find out. We'll see that. First of all, let's look at some of the Vanderbilts a little bit. We have two that are of local importance, and they are Alfred Gwynn and Reginald. You can see Alfred Gwynn up at the top right there, and Reginald just below him. They were brothers. This chart doesn't quite go far enough out to the side, but they were the same family. Reginald was the younger brother of Alfred Gwynn. There were other members of the Vanderbilt family as well. William H. II, they were the grandsons of Cornelius the Commodore. William H. II died while he was at Yale, and Cornelius III was disowned by the family because he married out of their class. He married Grace Graham Wilson, who ultimately became a real doyen of New York society. She was really one of the most important people and lived into the 1950s. But Cornelius was disinherited at first, but when his father died, he did get a small inheritance. Then it was Gertrude, Alfred Gwynn, and Reginald and Gladys. And Reginald's, the associations here are Alfred Gwynn with Oakland Farm and Reginald with Sandy Point Farm. Okay, so that's the link there. Reginald Claypool Vanderbilt, born in 1880, died in 1925, but established his country seat, that's what the newspapers called it, at Sandy Point Farm in 1902. He purchased 180 acres. It had been a fairly large farm before that, but he did put together some pieces. And for current reference, that farm, as it developed, was everything to the south of Sandy Point Avenue, from East Main Road to the water. And the pillars on the property, you can recognize those still out all the way out to the East Main Road. You can see common pillars along Sandy Point that were part of that farm. So he was the son of Cornelius II, who died early, died in 1899, and his wife, Alice Gwynn, who later became Alice of the Breakers, and she lived in the Breakers until 1934. Obviously the grand dame of the family at that point. Reggie was a horse person. He liked horses much better than working. He never worked a day in his life. He left Yale before graduating. There were various reasons for that, which I won't go into. He married Kathleen Nielsen and had a daughter named Kathleen as well. And so he came to, he had a home in New York City, and he came to this area and built his gentleman's farm at Sandy Point. And there were all kinds of activities that went on at Sandy Point. There were a lot of newspaper articles about the parties, a scene of gaiety at Sandy Point Farm last night. And they would have parties that went on all night. They would serve dinner and they would serve breakfast. And they would party all the time. The horse barn that was there was built in 1906. And it was designed by a famous architect by the name of A.S. Walker. And Walker designed the horse barn, which obviously is still standing today. And that's one thing about all these farms, is we still have a little bit of a remembrance of each of them that I'll talk about. But it's the horse barn at Sandy Point that is still there. A lot of the workers' cottages and things like that were torn down about 3 or 4 years ago at Sandy Point, so they could build some more condominiums there. Anyway, so a lot of functions there. They would have functions in the horse barn. Actually, they had a sort of a dance floor there, and they had places on the balcony for people to sit down at tables and eat and so on. And the party, it was a great place for parties. It was one of the preeminent horse breeding farms in the United States. They also bred, and I came across newspaper display ads for dogs, sheep, and other animals. They had all kinds of different animals that were raised there. Again, raised for show, and they showed them all over the place. The grounds, and you'll see some pictures in a couple minutes, the grounds were extraordinarily well maintained. I mean, I don't know how they did it without tractor lawnmowers. They must have done it with scissors. I don't know, the way they cut the grass. It was really incredible, but really extraordinarily well maintained. Reggie had a gambling problem. This is Reginald on the left here. He had a gambling problem. There's one case where he, in New York City, where he gambled over the course of a weekend and lost $400,000 just in one weekend. Okay, but Reggie really liked what were called in those days, I don't know if this term's still around anymore, but they were called hackneys. And this is Reggie driving a hackney. It's a two-wheeled cart with a horse. And again, if you have any appreciation for horses, you look at that horse and you say, what a gorgeous horse that is. I mean, it's just beautiful. And that's Dr. Selwonk. Dr. Selwonk, my son and I tried for a long time to try to figure out where that name came from. And it's such an odd name. We don't know where it came from. But the only thing we can figure is possibly, and there's no basis for this necessarily, it's the word Knowles spelled backwards. And perhaps there was a Dr. Knowles in his life somewhere. He had a lot of doctors in his life that had that name. And so that's where I think the name came from, but I'm not sure. Anyway, he was, and these are the gates to Sandy Point Farm that are still there, hopefully, with the house being built right behind him right now in the swamp right there. But it's pretty soft soil. They put in some extra drains and things like that. I actually talked to the people that were building it, and they said they had extra drains because they're concerned about water in the basement. If you look closely at those posts today, you can still see inscribed in them Sandy Point Farm. It says that on the right-hand side one. And this was where you went in. You went in through this gate right on the corner there of Sandy Point and East Main, Sandy Point and Wapping, and you went in past the polo field and on back to the barn and eventually to the villa. The villa was behind the barn. There's a house there now, but that's not the original, not the house that Reginald lived in. But that was behind the barn from this direction. And here's the barn. I was very fortunate one time about 15 years ago when I was thinking about writing about these farms that a woman in Portsmouth came up to me and said, I have some pictures you might be interested in. And so I jumped at the chance, which I always do, and went to her house, and she had brought out a leather album that had about 200 pictures of Sandy Point Farm in it. That's her on the left. When I met her, she was in her 80s. And she was really nice about loaning me this album. Copy whatever you want, just make sure you bring them back. And it's just a treasure trove. Again, look at the landscaping, look at the grass and so on. I mean, it's just extraordinarily well maintained. But it was Ruth Peckham was her name. She was the woman who loaned me these. This is another view of the farm. As you can see, the clock tower is still there, but this is the view from the other side, not from the Sandy Point Avenue side, but from back behind somehow. I don't know, I guess it was back one of the side roads down there. And this is the villa, and it was quite a villa. It was a big house, but it was often, especially under Reginald's ownership, it was often under reconstruction. If you really look close in that picture, you can see a man standing on top of the chimney. And staging around the chimney. One of the things about some of these photographs, and I'll point this out, is that this one like this, that has a typed name on the bottom, was photographed by a Fall River photographer by the name of O.E. Du Bois. And Du Bois was an itinerant photographer who rode around. I actually found on the back of one of his postcards, someone said what happened in Little Compton. He came here 2 weeks ago, took a picture of us standing in front of our house, and then came back today and sold them to us. He did that. He went around in a horse and buggy all over the whole Sakonnet area. We are so lucky that he did this, primarily between 1908 and 1913. And we have a treasure trove of photographs. They're very well composed photographs. He was a good photographer, and I treasure them. I did a book on him in 1983. I had 60 of his postcards. I said, can't be many more, so I said, I'll do that. So I did a book on him in 1960 and got a phone call soon after from his daughter, who called me and said, you know, I understand, you must want to talk to me. And I said, of course I do. And she said, I really want to thank you for honoring my father's memory. She was really nice about it. And she gave me a picture of the family, which I have. But Du Bois, again, I had 60 pictures. I did a book. I now have 570 of his postcards. Okay. And they're just wonderful postcards. You'll see several of them here in this show tonight. I have a collection of over 1,000 photographs and postcards of Portsmouth. Okay. 700 of Little Compton. Okay. And then Newport, again, he didn't go to Newport for some reason, but Newport, I have over 2,000 postcards and pictures. This is an interior view of Sandy Point Farm, and there's a picture of William H. Vanderbilt II in the background there. You can see, and this was probably a trophy room or something like that, either in the house or the barn, I'm not really sure. But you can see there's really nice mahogany stairs in the background and so on. It was really well proportioned. And of course the bar on the right-hand side too there. This is a picture, I didn't have a caption when I got this, and I really don't know what it was. It's probably people planning a horse show of some type. The second from the left is Reginald Vanderbilt. The third from the left is Alfred Gwynn, his brother. That's the only ones that I can identify in this photograph. But they were probably, you know, it might be someplace like the Breaker Stable or something like that where they were planning some kind of a show. Reginald looks a little out of it in that picture, which he was from time to time. 3 passions he had: horses, automobiles, and brandy milk punches. And again, not necessarily in that order. He had a real serious drinking problem, and it ultimately killed him. His wife, Kathleen, divorced him in 1919, and in 1922, at the age of 42, he met Gloria Morgan and fell in love with her. She was 17. She got a 16.5 carat diamond ring for her engagement ring, and they were married in 1923. They had one daughter, Gloria, who's still with us. Gloria Vanderbilt was born in 1924. But his health continued to deteriorate, even though he was very active participating in horse shows all over the country and various society events as well. On the 4th of September 1925, he died at Sandy Point Farm. He died of an esophageal hemorrhage, and his wife, who was on her way to meet her mother, was called back to the house, but then when she got back to the house, Alice of the Breakers would not let her see her husband, and he died that night. And after he died, the farm was sold to the Taylors, who lived next door at the Glen. Taylor family. We'll talk about them in a couple of minutes. Reginald had gone through almost just about all of his fortune. He had inherited about $7 million when his father died. And again, these dollar figures don't mean anything because $7 million is probably several hundred million dollars in modern currency. So he really had a fortune, and he went through it all. When he died, his estate was worth something like $120,000. Okay. Much of which he had gambled away, but also spent money on horses and things like that. They had an auction, and I have some photographs. I didn't put any in this slideshow, but an auction in 1925 of all of the equipment and all of the accoutrements for the horses. I don't know all the technical terms, but they all were, for the most part, they were all silver, real silver. Oakland was gold. Sandy Point was silver. And there was a great sale of the horses as well as all the equipment and so on at the farm. And the Taylors bought the farm. Taylors bought that farm, which extended Glen Farm to a total of 700 plus acres. Okay. Later on, I won't go into all the details, there was a custody battle for little Gloria. You might want to look at a book called Little Gloria, Happy at Last, which I helped contribute to when the author came here. I have pictures of the author and me in front of the gates, actually, that we talked about. And that was a custody battle between her mother and Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney, who was Reginald's sister. She was married to Harry Payne Whitney. And so ultimately Gertrude won that battle in a really dramatic, overpressed campaign in New York. The media went crazy with this one, as you might imagine. And Gloria is still with us today. She's really getting up there in years. She was born in 1924. And her son, Anderson Cooper, we see on television every night if we take a look at it. CNN. So most of Sandy Point Farm is houses today, but the horse barn still functions. The horse barn is still operational, and it's a beautiful barn, and it's really an impressive thing to just look inside sometime. It's really good. Still functioning. Okay, so Sandy Point. Again, 1902 when Reggie bought it, 1925 when he died. Okay, and he and his brother Alfred were among the children of William H. II. William H. II, by the way, was the person who built the breakers, both of them. First breakers, which burned down about a few months after it was built out of wood. And then they decided to get a little bit more impressive and built the second breakers. Okay, 1898, I think, somewhere, the second one. So Oakland Farm was a little bit different. Oakland Farm has a long history in Portsmouth history. It was a summer house back in colonial days for a man by the name of William Ellery Channing. Channing was a minister of the major congregational church in Boston. And he summered at Oakland Farm in a colonial farmhouse that was there. And he preached from time to time at the building, at a building which preceded the Portsmouth Historical Society. Not that particular building. That building was built in 1862, 63, but there was one there before. And he preached there from time to time in the summer. But it got into a really big, messy custody battle at the time of the death of Sarah Gibbs. Sarah Gibbs is the person who donated St. Mary's Church and the land for St. Mary's Church. And her tombstone her grave is right out in front of St. Mary's there. It's yay big. It's really huge. But there was a big custody battle among the family, and eventually the farm came to be owned by August Belmont. And we all know who August Belmont is. We see him down the corner of Bellevue Avenue and Narragansett Avenue. He's still sitting there on the corner, the statue of him there. He bought it in the 60s and lived there, owned it during the 70s. He didn't live there very much. He sold it to Alfred Gwynn's father, Cornelius II, in 1886. And then again, William H. got sidetracked by building the breakers and so on. And again, the breakers was a summer house. We just go there in the summer. We leave New York. And when they left New York, it was kind of interesting. A lot of these wealthy people in New York City had their own private train cars that they would come to Newport in. They couldn't quite come to Newport, the train didn't come that way, but they got to Wickford Junction. And at Wickford Junction in the summertime, you would see all these really elaborate train cars that individual people owned and had there. And then they would take a steamboat across, usually the General, which was the most common one, across from Wickford to Newport with all their accoutrements that they brought with them, of course. Newport, as I trust everybody knows, was really big in terms of social season and things like that in the summer. It's really, that's another lecture sometime. But anyway, so Cornelius II died in 1899 and left his estate primarily to Alfred Gwynn with a little bit to Reggie. And those were the two major male heirs at that point. Again, one had been disowned at that time because he married out of his class. Alice survived him and lived on until 1934 when she died at the age of 89 at the Breakers. And again, she was the grand dame of Newport society until that time. So Oakland was left then when he died to his son Alfred Gwynn in 1899, Alfred Gwynn Vanderbilt. Beginning somewhere around 1904, as best I can determine, there were major renovations done. The original colonial farmhouse was built around. I'll show you a picture of it in a couple minutes here. But it was really built around and extended dramatically. He also built horse barns, stables, and riding rings. But Alfred Gwynn's main passion was coach and four. He would have coaches, some of which are down the Breakers stable, and 4 horses. Of course, the 4 horses all exactly matched in terms of coloring and things like that, and that was really a big thing. Now, the riding ring that he built was viewed, at least by the newspapers at that time, as being the largest riding ring in the United States. It was huge. I have the dimensions. I don't have them in my presentation here, but it was just gigantic. So he built that. He built the stable that was there, and he enlarged the house and a lot of outbuildings. The only thing you can find is, as you go through Oakland Forest over there, about the only thing you could see as remembrances of Alfred Gwynn Vanderbilt is the base for the greenhouse, which is in the middle of the woods there someplace. We had until a couple, I don't think it's there anymore, on the corner of, right behind the Historical Society, on the corner of Middle Road and Union Street, there was a bull barn, a bull ring there. I don't know if that's still there or not. I haven't looked lately. Right, yeah, right by the golf course. And then they had a big farm barn behind that, right on the corner of the golf course there. They also had barns on the main part of the property as well. And I'll show you a picture of 1 or 2 of those in a minute. So, but again, everything except the Oakland Forest that has been preserved through the efforts of a lot of people that got involved in that about 15 years ago, including myself, not in terms of saving a forest, but in terms of the historical interpretation of the property. I was involved with a group of people, particularly Matt Largess, who's from Jamestown, who really worked hard to save that. It was kind of interesting. The people who were building condominiums there called him in as an arborist. He's an outstanding arborist, and asked him to evaluate those trees that were in that last plot to be developed. And his reaction was, don't touch it. And we got a campaign going with a lot of people involved, including, interestingly, a donation, a significant donation from Alfred Gwynn Vanderbilt's granddaughter up in Massachusetts to save that forest. And it's wonderful. If you've never been there, go. There's a great walking trail through it. It's really something to see. In fact, Gary Plunkett's been giving tours of that lately, and I went on one in the spring. It's really interesting. So he married Ellen Tuck French at first, and later Margaret Emerson McKim. He had 3 children, William H. III, Alfred Gwynn Jr., and George. And the one that is most important to us of those 3 at this point is William H. William H. III, who inherited Oakland Farm when his father died. This is a photograph, again, another Du Bois photograph of the riding ring. Okay, this is taken from East Main Road, looking into the farm. But what you have to look closely at this picture. If you look to the right of the riding ring, you see all these really neat stick and shingle kind of barns, all these little domes that come out, okay? And the riding ring was just unbelievable. It had a place, it had apartments in it for people to stay, it had a swimming pool, it had a trophy room, it's just amazing. But the whole structure of the farm, see those buildings in the background on the right, you'll see a close-up of those in just a second here. This is again on a coach. This is Alfred Gwynn on the left and Reginald on the right. Again, looking a little distant, shall we say. The picture on the right is the picture of the farmhouse. And again, it was a colonial house that was added on to many, many times, as you can see. Alfred Gwynn really built that up. And again, look at the grass edging on the road and so on. I mean, this was fine work that was done very likely by hand in those days. I mean, they had lawnmowers, but the lawnmowers were pulled by horses. Okay, so as far as the local stuff, it was a lot done by hand. This is a better picture of the house. Again, as amended, shall we say. And one of the interesting features about this house that always intrigued me is you look at the chimney there in the middle, to the left of the middle, and there's a window right in the middle of it, which is kind of an unusual feature of it. Again, there's a real colonial house underneath there somewhere. And even the cows posed for photographer Du Bois here. But look at the finish work on the barns behind. I mean, that's not your average barn by any means. It really was uniquely done. They were really pretty special. And again, here's some of the horses out in front of the one of the barn buildings. There were a lot of people in Portsmouth whose father, grandfather, mostly grandfathers and beyond, worked for Oakland Farm or Sandy Point or the Glen. People still around. People come up to me from time to time and say, well, my grandfather was there on the farm and so on. There's a lot of those people still around. But nice to get all the horses posing for the photographer. This is the stable. Okay. Again, the ornateness of it is pretty extraordinary. And this is, again, another Du Bois postcard. Really something special. That was, as you go in, the road into the Oakland Farm condominiums. This would have been just to the left. Okay, it's all gone. All of this is gone. Okay. The house, the riding ring, the stable, it's all gone. And it all was around most of it around until 1946, 47. I'll talk about that in a minute. But it all kind of deteriorated and was eventually torn down. Okay, more about that in a second. So Alfred didn't work very much either. Alfred built a hotel in New York, the Vanderbilt Hotel, and the top 2 floors were his penthouse, if you will. And he was mainly involved in horses and coaches. Coaching was a really big thing to him. And we've been really lucky, over the last, 15 years or so to have coaching demonstrations come here 3 or 4 or 5 times. And it's really kind of neat to see these things. Have the little Dalmatian running along behind. But Alfred actually went to Europe often to drive, and he particularly went on a special ride that was London to Brighton. That was a special route that only the best people could drive that, and he drove it. I found a newspaper account talking about his experiences of driving that. All of the Vanderbilt coaches began, and all of the horses' names began with V, by the way. Venture was the really big coach that he had. And again, a couple of those are still around. They're still in, Breaker Stable has 1 or 2 at least at this point. And others have shown up for these coaching demonstrations that we've had. So in May of 1915, Alfred decided he was going to go to England in order to attend a planning meeting for the International Horse Show Association. He was a director of that association, and so he went to England for that. Unfortunately, however, he sailed on the Lusitania. And the Lusitania was torpedoed by a German U-boat. This is during World War I. Okay. The German U-boat U-20 torpedoed the Lusitania, which was a British ship, off the coast of Kinsale Head, off the southeast coast of Ireland. And they were inside of land. They actually could see land from where the ship was sinking, and it sank fairly quickly. But there was an interesting thing that happened. When I was trying to find out more about what happened to him, I went looking and found his will, unbelievable will, in the Portsmouth town clerk's office, okay, Portsmouth archive. His will is there, and in addition to all the tremendous number of things that were left to various people, one of the things that was there was an attachment to his will. And what happened was they never found his body. But there's an account by Miss Loney, whoever that is, and I don't know, it's a testimony attached to his will that says that when she was standing on the deck next to him as the ship was sinking, and he turned and gave his life jacket to a woman, but he couldn't swim. And so he died on the Lusitania, which was a really tragic event. His body was never recovered, and they spent a lot of time trying to find his body to see whether or not, in fact, he had died because of this huge fortune that he had. And of course, there's probably nobody more interested in that than Reginald Vanderbilt himself, because he stood to inherit most of it. Okay. So Alfred Gwynne died on the Lusitania, and this is the Oakland Forest. Okay. Oakland Farm was given to his eldest son, to his son William, who was only 11 at the 13 at the time, 14 at the time, and he inherited Oakland Farm to be given to him when he was 21, which is in 1922. And William Vanderbilt lived there until the 40s, and Oakland Farm was a great place where people had Easter egg hunts and all kinds of events, children fairs for St. Mary's Church, and so on. There would be a great deal of activity that went on at that farm. They really opened up the farm quite often to various charitable functions. He was a state senator from Portsmouth back in the days when each town, how simple was this? Each town had one senator. Little Compton had one, Providence had one, okay? Kind of interesting. But he was our state senator here in Portsmouth in the late 30s, and he was elected governor of Rhode Island in 1938 and served one term. And in that one term, he laid off 4,000 state workers, and he brought the budget into balance, and therefore he wasn't going to last very long. He was a Republican as well, of course, so he didn't last very long. He was replaced in the next election in 1940 by a man that some of you may have heard of, named J. Howard McGrath, who went on to a long career in politics in Rhode Island. And William H. decided, well, right after that, he went into the Navy. He was in the Navy during World War II. And as the war ended, he decided he was going to leave Portsmouth. By that time, the farm was beginning to deteriorate. And so he went out to western Massachusetts, to Williamstown, Massachusetts, where he ran a grocery store, a general store. And he lived there, stayed there, until he died in 1981. And again, he had 3 daughters, 2 of which were twins, and at least one of them that I know was still alive a few years ago. I don't know. I haven't really checked on the family genealogy beyond that. So the farm, it was sold to Robert Young. Robert Young was married to a sister of Anita O'Keefe, who was a famous artist of the Southwest. And they weren't interested in fixing it up. They weren't interested in living there. And so over time, just because of wind and weather and snow and everything else, things began to deteriorate. And eventually by 1945, 46, 47, most of Oakland Farm's buildings were torn down. One of the newspaper accounts said that the wood from the riding ring was used to build 20 houses. Okay. Now, this is an aerial photograph I took a few years ago of the Oakland Forest. And again, you can see the condominiums all around, but that forest has been preserved, as well as the meadow, which is next to it on the left-hand side in this photograph. This. Pardon? Where would East Main Road be? East Main Road would be out beyond the forest, beyond the edge of the trees, running across the picture. This is looking east, okay, across the forest. Union Street would be, what's the name of the street that's behind this forest? it's a new housing development area. That you can see that on the left there. Carriage Drive, yeah, that's there. So that gives you a little bit of perspective on it. It's a wonderful resource.
How do you access it?
You go down Carriage Drive, and there's a parking lot there. They don't really like you to access it from the condominium complex. In fact, they don't like you to fly over that complex either. I did on a helicopter, but I told the helicopter pilot, I said, let's go right across the floor. He said, no, we don't do that, because the phone would start ringing. But anyway, but there is an access on Carriage Drive. There's actually a parking lot there and a little bit of an introductory board. This is an area that's been preserved by the Land Trust, and the Land Trust has signage there for it. One other thing, just to say that in the mail today, I received a book called Alfred Gwynne Vanderbilt. And it says, the unlikely hero of the Lusitania. Okay? I don't know, I talked to the author of this book. I contributed a little bit to this book, not a lot, but I contributed to it. And he came and saw me and came back a couple months ago. I didn't know it was coming out so soon. But anyway, I got this in the mail. It's available now. It just came out. And it has a lot of pictures of Oakland and places like that in it. I did give him some pictures. He used some of mine. But anyway, A Life of Alfred Gwynne, which hasn't really been done, as far as I know, otherwise. But that just came out. Stephen Gittleman, he's a gentleman from down on Long Island who got interested. He's what's the title? He's the president of the board of a Vanderbilt museum down there. And it says so in the book, the title, but we've talked at some length about that. But anyway, that's kind of neat. I'm anxious to read that my spare time. Okay, let's look at Glen Farm. And this, most of us, I hope, are somewhat familiar with. The family that owned Glen Farm throughout its existence, really, until it finally was sold to make a girls' prep school, was the Moses Taylor family. And Moses Taylor, this was yesterday's book, The Business Career of Moses Taylor. Literally, I got this one yesterday and the Vanderbilt one today. It'd be nice to have these when I wrote a book about these people. But anyway, Moses Taylor, the original Moses Taylor, was started as a merchant, as a clerk, and then a merchant, and built a huge business. It's interesting that we don't hear much about him when we look at the life in New York in the 1870s and 80s. His main accomplishment in terms of longevity was the establishment of a bank called Citibank that later became Citicorp. And he was one of the main founders of that. He did a lot of other stuff too, though. He owned a bunch of railroads, especially in eastern Pennsylvania, the Delaware and Lackawanna Railroad, and several others. He invested in the cabling across the Atlantic Ocean when they laid the cable across. He was involved in that. He was a very wealthy man. He also was a personal advisor to Lincoln during the Civil War. But again, until I started on this research and having taught history for about 30 years at that point, I'd never really heard much about him. But I have learned a lot more about him, and I really will when I read this book. Anyway, Moses Taylor was involved in a lot of different businesses and died in 1882. And his son, H.A.C. Taylor, Henry Augustus Coit Taylor. And Henry Augustus Coit was a partner of Moses Taylor. So I guess he named his son after his partner. Henry Augustus Coit Taylor, always known as Hack Taylor for obvious reasons. He was born in 1841 and lived until 1921. He was involved with his father's businesses a lot and continued to grow the family's wealth. Railroads, steel industry in eastern Pennsylvania, a lot of eastern Pennsylvania involvement around Scranton, Wilkes-Barre, that area. Okay. So what happens, and if you look at, and I did a lot of research on this family in terms of that, and last week I had someone here at my talk who gave me about 15 pictures of the family finally, 5, 6, 7 years after I wrote the book. But anyway, we're getting together and we're going to exchange our data that we have. Anyway, HAC decided he was going to build a farm out in Portsmouth in 1882. And so if you look at the land evidence records, you can see at least 20 to 25 transactions that he made in which he bought up this guy's 10 acres, this guy's 30 acres, this guy's 25 acres, and so on, and put this all together as a farm. Essentially, geographically, everything between Glen Road and Sandy Point Avenue, from East Main Road to the water. Okay? But they also had land on the other side of Glen Road as well, especially down at the water end. They had what was called Stanton Farm down there, which is where they had kept a lot of their horses later on. So HAC, it's kind of interesting that he started buying all these properties in the same year that his father died. So obviously he had a pretty significant inheritance in which he was able to do this. Okay. He never built a house out there. In fact, some of the houses that were there were moved. If you go down Glen Road, on the left-hand side, there's a house there that had been known for a long time as Miss Durfee's Tea House. And this was, Prescott Chase lived there, Julia Pell lived there later. Not sure who's living there now. But that's a house that used to be on the right-hand side of Glen Road. That when HAC came, they moved the houses across the road, along with the barn. And the barn for Miss Durfee's Tea House was made into a house, and it's still there too as a house. And what's her name? Mrs. Bryan lived there. Mrs. Bryan and I had a few conversations. She's gone now, but Penelope Bryan is her name. Anyway, they moved all the houses off the property essentially. But a lot of those houses ultimately became workers' houses, people who worked on the farm. But anyway, so he started buying up all this to create his own gentleman's farm. And one of the interesting things about him was that his obituary in the Daily News, in the New York Times it was about that long, Daily News it wasn't quite that big, but his obituary said that he moved to Portsmouth because he didn't like the taxes in Newport. Okay. Interesting. Now he lived, the Taylor house in Newport was off, was it Faxon Green, off the left-hand side of Annandale Road, behind the wall. Okay, that's where the Taylor house was. And the house was there until the 1950s. I think it burned at that point. But anyway, that was their main house. And the family, and I think it was HAC, yeah, it was HAC, married a Fearing. And the Fearings owned the big house on the corner of Narragansett and Annandale. Okay, right, that one behind the gates right now. So again, they were all in that area. So HAC decided he was going to, he lived somewhere on the farm, and I don't know where. I tried to track that down, but I couldn't figure out where. And again, he was only here in the summer because he was running his businesses otherwise. So he had a couple hundred acres as well, and they built the barn complex. Again, if you go down the barn, and don't be afraid to do that, by the way, if you're afraid of trespassing or something. That's all town property where the horse barns are and so on down there. And almost every one of the barns has a date over the door. And most of them are in the range of 1902 to 1911. And again, it's deteriorated a little bit these days, but it really was gorgeous back in 100 years ago. This is a view of some of the barns at that time. There was a bull barn, a horse barn, and various other animals in different barns down there. And they're all still standing, although they also had their own veterinarian shop, their own carriage repair place, and those unfortunately were torn down. They just disintegrated and were torn down. So he decided later on in the teens that he was going to build an appropriate manor house. And he hired John Russell Pope as an architect. John Russell Pope is a very famous American architect, if you're not familiar with him. He designed the Jefferson Memorial, the National Archives, the National Gallery of Art, the, I think of the name, not the Metropolitan, but the other major museum across the street from the Metropolitan in New York. Think of the name in a minute. But he was primarily what we call Beaux-Arts architecture, big, splashy, a lot of stonework and things like that. Didn't far as I know, didn't do any. Oh, he did do one thing in Newport. The what's it called? I think of the name. Gosh, my mind's going. But anyway, he did do a couple of houses in Newport, but not the really big mansions. The Waves, that's what I'm trying to think of, which is down right on the water, right on the rocks there. And he lived there, part-time. Anyway, the Taylors decided they wanted a chateau, a French-style chateau. And so they got Pope to design it. The builder's plans exist. They're in the town hall. They're kept under pretty tight security these days, but I've seen them, and his plans. And the plans were dated 1920. And so the plans were 1920, and the house began to be built soon after that. It was completed in 1923, best I can determine. The Olmsted brothers were hired to do the landscaping of the property. HAC, meanwhile, had created nurseries around the different parts of the property, so they were able to move large trees. Remember, they're moving this with a minimum amount of heavy-duty equipment. And the Olmsted brothers, this is the sons of Frederick Law Olmsted. Frederick Law Olmsted died in 1909, but this was his company run by his sons that did this. And we're really lucky, while I was on the Manor House Committee, that Dick Wimpress came up with the landscaper's notes on this, letters back and forth with the Taylors, and some of them are really pretty humorous, because they'll say something like, well, there's a letter from somebody to somebody saying, the Taylors are coming next week, and we promised we would move that tree 2 feet to the left, so we better get down there and get that done before they get here. They supervised the landscaping a lot. Anyway, they were right on top of it. Not only HAC at the beginning, but his son Moses and his wife Edith, who came along next. HAC died while the house was being built. In 1921, he died, so he never really saw the completion of it. But it was inherited by his son Moses and his wife Edith. And so the Taylor family continued on. Glen Farm was an important breeding farm for Guernsey and Black Angus cattle, for thoroughbred horses, for Percheron horses. Percherons are dray horses. They're big, heavy horses. And they stabled them in Stanton Farm up to the left of Glen Road, winds around. The stables are still there. And they also had sheep and show animals. Now, not only did these people compete nationwide, they competed at the Newport County Fair as well. And there were all kinds of competitions went on. I mean, if you go on the Breaker Stable, there's ribbons all over the place, some national and some local. They really did compete. And it was the kind of thing where, you sift the soil so that your carrots are nice and straight. They don't have any bends in them. And they had them at show. The Newport County Fair existed from 1898 until 1933 and run by the Agricultural Association. And it was fiercely competitive among these gentlemen's farms, not only for show, but more for, carrots and other farm crops and so on that were evaluated. It's an interesting history to that, too. So the Manor House was completed in 1923, and the Taylors began to summer there, again, 6 to 8 weeks, usually 1st of July or so through September, beginning of September, sometimes a little bit later. The season really ended in Newport about the middle of September, and everybody went back to New York or wherever. The Manor House obviously is a French chateau. It has some Italianate trimmings, such as on the porch. On the veranda, you have that sort of wooden lattice work against one wall. That's Italianate, and there are some Italianate features. But one of the really interesting things about it is, and I read this when I was reading some of the accounts of it, that the house was decorated inside similarly to the Petit Trianon, which is one of the palaces at Versailles. There's the main Versailles Palace, and then down over the hill there's the Grand Trianon and the Petit Trianon. And some of the features in the Manor House are exact copies of the Petit Trianon. I had a friend who went there. I never quite got down over the hill. When I was there a couple of years ago, it was just, I couldn't get out of the Hall of Mirrors. It was so crowded, you couldn't move. But the garden, the landscaping is actually wonderful there. And the Petit Trianon is down over the hill. And the chandelier over the stairway and the stairway itself at the Glen Manor House are absolute copies of similar things at the Petit Trianon. So he did design it inside, very much like that particular palace, one of Louis XIV's palaces at Versailles, outside of Paris. So Moses and Edith summered there until his death in 1928. And Edith, 10 years later, married G.J. Guthrie Nicholson. And they continued to summer there over time. Glen Farm was a very productive farm. This is a book, personal, published for the family. I forget where it came from. But it was a magazine article, a very extensive magazine article, a story of Glen and Annandale farms. And it's a picture, an account of how Glen Farm came about in the 1920s in particular. There's some really interesting pictures in it, and you could eat off the floor of the stables. I mean, they're just unbelievable. But almost all of this book is a picture of famous horses and cows. Okay, that's what's in this. There's some of the Percheron horses. Again, they were big, bulky horses. Cows, okay. But anyway, whoops. This is a publication for the family. Also, I came across this on eBay, which is taken out of a magazine. Can't think of the name of it. Anyway, it's a picture of the manor house. And it says designed by John Russell Pope, and I use this as the cover on my book that I wrote on the Gentleman Farms. There's that. Now, G.J. Guthrie Nicholson died in 1950, and Edith continued to summer there until her death in 1959. She died in Charleston, South Carolina, but still had the manor house. Meanwhile, the manor house or the Glen Farm rather, some of it had been sold off. A lot of the workers' houses were sold to the workers themselves. The last one, which was sold in about 2000 or so, the one on the corner of Glen Farm Road and Sandy Point Avenue. Anyway, one of the things the Taylors did, they had a nice boat, a nice yacht. It was called the Iolanda. And it was pretty big ship. When I was in the Navy, I was on a destroyer that was 2,200 tons. Iolanda was 1,822 tons, almost as big as a Navy destroyer, okay, with a crew of 56. And they took it all over the world. And they took it to Europe often. They actually, there's an interesting story associated with it, that the Iolanda was chartered first by Moses Taylor for a trip around from England around the coast of France and down around the coast of Africa to Cape Town, South Africa. Then they turned around and came back and went into Italy. Well, I came across in the library here a book privately published called Diary of Happenings Aboard S.Y. Iolanda. And I Xeroxed the whole thing. But this is an account of a trip in the date's in here, 1927, commencing at Southampton and privately printed in New York in 1927. There were, again, 56 crew members, 5 passengers. Okay. And one of the passengers wrote this account. Here's a map of where they went. Whoops, you can see they went along the coast of Africa all the way down to the bottom. Okay. But he has this account. Remember, this is a chartered yacht that they had. There are some pictures in here. There's a picture of Mrs. Taylor cutting Moses Taylor's hair, sitting on the deck of the ship. It's a diary, Saturday, February 19th, arrived Cape Town, etc. And the final comment in the book is really kind of interesting, because this doctor who was writing this, of course you had to have a doctor along, the doctor who was writing this says in the last line of the book, and the word God is spelled G-A-W-D, God help us all, the boss has bought the yacht. Okay, so he bought it, and then they had it, and I'm going to show you a picture of it in a minute. It's really an impressive ship. But they took it across into Europe quite often. And eventually in World War II, as World War II broke out, before we got involved in it, Mrs. Taylor gave it to the British for $5. And it was used as a submarine chaser in the English Channel. And I've come across a recent account after I was convinced that this was what happened to it, that it was sunk during World War II, an account that it survived. And I'm not sure of the actual fate of it yet. It's still, you can Google it and you can find out a lot about it. It's kind of interesting. But this is what it looked like. You didn't bring that one into the Sakonnet River. Okay. This is the Iolanda in the Panama Canal, in the Galliard Cut, Panama Canal. Again, a crew of 56. In this particular trip described here, 5 passengers. Okay. I'm sure they had enough room to wander around. It's an interesting account, though. It's in the special collections of the library. And I don't think you can check it out, but you can at least look at it here. Unless you really want to spend a lot of money and copy the whole thing, which I do. This is Glen Farm in 1926. Again, this is taken from that book that I showed, the brown book that I showed you. It shows you the manor house, and it shows you to the right of the manor house is the laundry building, the little square building there to the side of it. This shows you all of the farm except the horse barns, which would be out of the picture on the left. But they had a very impressive dock, and Mrs. Taylor had a 21-foot sailboat called Newport, N-I-E-U-P-O-R-T, which she sailed around. It could be tied up at the dock. And at the dock itself, there was a wonderful boathouse that some of us remember. It was a French chateau kind of building. And unfortunately, as in the downtime, as far as the manor house was concerned, it got vandalized a lot and got really beat up. But this shows you, and Mrs. Taylor had a rose garden that she opened up from time to time for the people of the town to come in and see. It's a beautiful rose garden down over the hill from where we look at the manor house. This is a recent, not recent, 7-8 years ago, picture of the barn complex at Sandy Point, at Glen rather. And one of the unfortunate things is that you have this whole paddock area that was really beautifully laid out and everything, and it's pretty much all gone now. Fences have all come down. They had a power plant at the Glen. Again, part of it's still there, sort of, down over the hill off Glen Farm Road. It had a water wheel at one time. And up at the top of that rise, they had this mill building that goes back to the 18th century. The building's still there, what's left of it. And what we don't realize is there was a mill pond right below it. You can see the pond here. And the town, for various reasons, liability reasons mostly, I guess, when they took over this, they destroyed that mill pond. And a lot of really neat stone architecture that drained it on down to the Sakonnet River. But that's what it looked like back in the day, as they say. The gates from Glen Farm, and I was corrected last week when I talked about this, they have been at Belcourt Castle. Somebody said they've been taken down right now. Hopefully they'll be put back up, but these are the same gates that guided your entrance into Glen Farm. And there's, in the middle of that scroll work up on the top, there's a T, which in those days stood for Taylor, and of course later on with Belcourt stood for Tinney. The Tinneys have sold it. It's now being refurbished a lot, and again, someone told me last week, I should go look, that the gates have been taken down. I sure hope they'll get put back up. Those gates went across Glen Road. There's a house there. The gatehouse is still there. Unfortunately, somebody decided to paint it orange. It stands out rather, and that's where the gate went across, just over the brow of the hill there, before you get to the road down to the Glen Manor House. This is what the manor house looked like. They had a big pond there, which again, I think probably the town decided it might be a big liability. A lot of brides and grooms probably would have found their way into the pond. This member of the Taylor family that was here last week told me that a lot of the family ended up in that pond too. The landscaping was extraordinary there. Mrs. Taylor gave a lot of donations to the town, including the room right behind us over here, the Portsmouth room here. She donated that to the library, donated the money for that to the library. And her son, Reginald, gradually disposed of the farm after she died in 1959. Elmhurst came there from 1961 to 62. I have to talk a little bit faster here. And eventually the town purchased most of the estate in 72 and in 89. 144 acres under town ownership now. Still in the news, as you might notice from last week's town council meeting. Anyway, the manor house is we know what the manor house is for today. All these trees in the courtyard have been taken down, and that's probably a good thing. They were really hard to trim and maintain, and it really looks very nice right now. One final thing, Greendale. Greendale is still a gentleman's farm. It was established back in 1864 by John Sargent Barstow. Still functions as a gentleman's farm. It was designed by John Sturgis, the manor house. Barstow came to enjoy the life of a country gentleman here, and it fell into disrepair in the late 19th century. But Major General James Parker, who won the Medal of Honor in the Spanish-American War, retired from the Army after World War I, and he and his wife decided to build Greendale back up and put it into the working farm. It passed down through the descendants of the general, and of course they continue to own it today with Nancy Parker and her daughter, Nancy Parker Wilson. And here's a picture of that. The only other building, a similar building to that, is the Newport Art Association, okay. Designed by the same architect. And this is the restored tasting room at Greendale, an old barn. Final conclusions. We have a tradition of gentlemen's farms that's pretty unique to Portsmouth history at the time I've been talking about. No other community around here has gentlemen's farms to speak of. We're lucky that so much of this has been preserved. A lot of it is open space. And the early growth forest at Oakland, the horse barn at Sandy Point, the manor house, and Greendale are all a testimony to really the greatness of Portsmouth past history. And that's the end, I think. So that's where we are. I'm supposed to go an hour, and I just did. Okay. I'll be happy to answer questions if anybody has questions about anything that I may have glossed over. Yes?
If you could elaborate, first of all, thank you, fascinating. If you could elaborate on the mill pond at Glen Farm.
Mm-hmm.
So we know that there was a dam there that had like a little, I guess, a hydroelectric mill.
Well, it had a water wheel back in the 18th century.
I always figured that was just decay and erosion, that the dam was actually...
No, I think it was deliberately done. Yeah, and I think you can see that, that if you look closely at that. The mill pond was, and you can see where the mill pond was too, because there's this big cup there, which is for sale. Trying to get somebody to build a house on it, I guess. I don't know. Been for sale for about 10 years, I think. But that you can see where the mill pond was, and it wasn't quite up to the building. It seems like it was a little bit lower than the building, but I don't remember it. That was a place when I first came to town, which was 50 years ago. You didn't get on there. That was all private property. But it's an I have some photographs of it. I have some actual, what do you call it, stereographs of the mill pond itself, which is pretty interesting. People sitting there fishing and so on. Any other questions? Pardon?
How many, I think you said it was originally 144.
No, Glen Farm originally was 700 plus. Yeah. And I mean, it included Sandy Point Farm, for example, which is that whole hillside over there. And it shrank through, one family after another taking it over. They sold Sandy Point Farm. The Taylor sold Sandy Point Farm to a horse breeder at one point. Can't remember her name. Other questions? Yes?
That large boat, Iolanda,
Iolanda.
the fellow that was involved in it was Nicholson. And would that be any of the Nicholson Filer Company?
I'm not sure. He was a rancher from out in Idaho someplace. I don't think so. He was married to Mrs. Taylor. He married, after Moses died, she married him 10 years later. And he was involved in mining, I think, out in the far west. But yeah, he was a businessman as well. It was funny because he had a career out in the west as a mining owner, but he also had what was it? Something down in Arizona or Louisiana, somewhere down south. He owned railroads, things like that. He was well off.
Ancestor of the Nicholson Blackfoot Farm?
Yeah, well, G.J. Guthrie Nicholson Jr. lived over on Black Point. Did he live at Black Point? I'm not sure, but he lived.
In the old house down at the end.
Yeah. I remember him. I remember seeing him at town meetings. quite a while ago, but I never really met him. Yeah, it was the same family. Anybody else? Questions? Yes?
Newport, if I may. A few years back, Glen Farm of Newport wrote an article about one of the barns at Oakland Farm was reputed to have quite a bit of artwork along its walls, and when the barn was dismantled, he was inquiring as to what happened to all of that artwork. Does anybody still exist? I wonder if you can, am I right in my memory on that? I wonder if you can comment on.
I've heard that, and I think probably as William H., who left Portsmouth after World War II, I think they pretty much took all that stuff with them. There's a family portrait, for example, of William H. and his wife and their 3 daughters that I've seen reproduced. And this other daughter that I had heard about, communicated with by mail, said that she had that portrait. So I think they distributed a lot of that. There is a picture, and I don't know who has it. There's a painting of the Commodore Vanderbilt, which is no doubt worth a fortune at this point. I think it's still in the family someplace, but I don't know. It's hard to update all of this. You look at that family chart, and yeah, you're dealing with Reggie and Alfred Gwynn and 5 or 6 siblings, but then you keep on going, and that's like in Portsmouth. Everybody in Portsmouth that I've ever met is descended from Anne Hutchinson. Well, maybe. Not everybody, just 80 or 90%. But that's the kind of thing that you have to deal with. Genealogy, I try to avoid genealogy, frankly. I don't really like doing genealogy. My brother has done our family genealogy, and I'll leave that to him. But it's too frustrating. It's hard making the links. It really is. We had some people here, I don't think they're here tonight, but people here last week who are looking for 2 families, Motts and Slocums. Well, Motts and Slocums were here in 1638 and 39. Okay, so how do you track those? That's really hard. I have a friend who's writing a history of Slocum, Rhode Island. There is a Slocum, Rhode Island. It's part of North Kingstown. And I'm helping her write it. And I live in Slocum Farm. And there's a little Slocum Farm there too. And there's a graveyard there with Slocums in it. There's also one down the Glen that has Slocums in it. And so we've been trying to put Slocums together. It's not easy. But they migrated from here to Jamestown to North Kingstown about 1741. Pardon? The Motts were over on the West Main Road, yeah, Mott Farm. Yep. That's all houses now too. Anyway, any other questions, quick? I'll be glad that you can look at any of this stuff that you want to up here. I do have some of my books here. This is the one that's about the Gentleman Farms. Lots of pictures in it of different things, a lot more pictures than you've seen here today. But that was one of my efforts. I've written 6 books altogether. There are only 3 left, three different ones left. And I keep getting asked for the first 3. I don't want a recent one. I want the one you did in 1976. Anyway, okay, so thank you very much for coming. Appreciate it. Thanks.